Should we talk about the Shadow of Weng-Chiang?
I think we should, Dave. It's that time. And again, we mentioned at the start of the show, earlier this week, we released a synopsis of the novel. So if you've not heard that and you do want to know what the novel's all about, go and listen to that episode. Otherwise, let's begin, Dave, with I want to read something from the start of the book. Which is the first paragraph of what David A. McKinty calls Bumph, which is like his introduction to the book, before the prologue even.
I will open my copy and read along with you.
Okay. He says, "They say the best sequels are those that take different paths from their predecessors. Aliens is a good sequel, while Friday the 13th Part Whatever isn't. Those of you hoping for the further adventures of Jago and Lightfoot in Victorian London, therefore, are in for a disappointment. This is, with any luck, a separate entity." And I'll close the book on that. Isn't it funny that they did actually do a Jago and Lightfoot series, a big finish? But in this case, the Shadow of Weng-Chiang, David A. McKinty took it in a whole different direction.
It's so true, and that really takes me to my very first memory of the book, because I was obviously active in fandom at the time that the Virgin books were coming out. I was reading most of the New Adventures and most of the Missing Adventures when I could, and I can remember the Shadow of Weng-Chiang being released. And first of all, it was just a title and an author on a list of coming releases, and we all said, Weng-Chiang, is this a sequel to Talons? Wow, what's going on here? Then we got the cover, and it's got Mr. Sin on it, the Peking homunculus. And we discover that it's set in Season 16. And not just the beginning or the end of Season 16, it's actively set between the Stones of Blood and the Androids of Tara. So how does that work? There isn't an extra segment of the Key to Time, and those adventures were all pretty contiguous. So before it was even released, it really was one of those ones that as fans we noticed and said, how is this going to work?
Look, it seems like you're talking about your early memories of the release, so I'll counter with mine, Dave. This book comes from that period, along with the NAs in general, where I wasn't engaged with Doctor Who at all. Now, admittedly, this one came out around mid-1996, so I guess I'm in the process of coming back via the TV movie.
Mm-hmm.
And in a short period of time, I'll be engaging with the EDAs and the PDAs. But this is an example of many in the NAs and MAs that I didn't notice at the time as far as I can recall. I mean, hey, I might have seen it in a bookshop and thought, oh, wow, it's a Weng-Chiang related book, cool. But I have no actual memory of that happening. I'd be making it up if I said that happened, although it very well could have happened. I don't know. And in the years since, it's a book I hadn't actually read until now, so I thank the listeners for selecting it.
Yes, look, I did read it at the time. I must admit my memories were very hazy about it. It was at that time where the telly movie was coming out and everything was getting very exciting and very hectic. I will say, as just a bit of background, it is by David A. McKinty, who is one of the doyens of the Virgin range, and in fact of Doctor Who books generally. His first new adventure was White Darkness. That was okay. First Frontier, though, one of my top 10 new adventures. Sanctuary, friend of the podcast, Richard, rates that as one of his all-time favourite new adventures. So,
oh, really?
Bit of a reputation there. Lords of the Storm, a Davo book that didn't win this poll, but it is quite well done. And The Dark Path, which has the first encounter between the Troughton Doctor and the man who will become the Master, is quite well known as one of the standouts of the Missing Adventure range. And that came after the Shadow of Weng-Chiang, as did his past Doctor BBC book, The Face of the Enemy, which I've often put in the top 10 of my Doctor Who fiction books, full stop. So he had a very strong reputation as being a good writer, but maybe not one of the big fan favourites, but as a very solid writer who kept getting work.
He's got a particular flavour, I can tell from this, that might not go down well with all Doctor Who fans.
That's very true. He's very big on his research. He's very big on putting together worlds. Sanctuary is, I believe, the only pure historical that the New Adventures did, so there's not even a small alien artifact or something to mix in with the plot. It is just the Doctor trapped in, I think it's France, at a particular time. So, yeah, very, very big on his historical stuff. White Darkness, his first book, as I said, that's set in 1950s Haiti from memory. Right. And again, there was lots of... This is my research about Haitian voodooism and Haitian religion and Haitian colonialisation and all of that sort of thing. So, yeah.
Yeah, and he's not a very fluffy writer. I'm picking that up too.
It sounds like we're moving into our opinions here, Rob. So why don't you keep going and give us your big, overarching view?
Spoiler free? Okay.
Go on.
Dave, I think I'm safe in saying this isn't fluffy. This is a very gun novel rather than a very frock novel. Can I start by saying that?
Yes, I think that's fair.
We've got a wonderfully real, gritty sort of representation of China in the 1930s under Japanese oppression. We've got tongs, we've got opium dens, we've got fancy nightclubs. Think of the start, folks, of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. That's what this is across much of the book. In fact, I can't help but think that given many of the things that happen in the novel, including Romana as a nightclub singer, don't panic, folks, that's not a spoiler, McGinty is absolutely a fan of that film and is riffing hard on it in places. And that's fine for me. I adore the Indiana Jones franchise. I'll stop there for the moment.
I certainly think this was a very good book. Is it jumping into my list of sort of the top 3 or 4 missing adventures? Probably not. But did I find it very easy to read? Did I want to go back each night and I want to go back and read more of this book? I want to find out what's happening. Absolutely I did. Are there some fairly big problems with the book? Yes, there are, and I'll talk about those. Are there some pluses? Absolutely there are. And the big key point that I'll make is I sort of now transition maybe from spoiler-free opinion into slightly spoilery further extrapolation, is just to talk very briefly about the missing adventures themselves and how this feels in that range. Mm-hmm. Now, Rob, when we did our special some years ago now on the Virgin New Adventures, we did a 20-minute sidestep into the missing adventures because they deserved to be talked about as well. They were a big deal at the time. And I made the point then, and I stand by this point, that the missing adventure writers had it a lot harder than the New Adventures writers. The New Adventures writers just had to do 2 things: write a good book and write a book that was in tune with new, modern, 90s style Doctor Who. Mm. The Missing Adventures had it much harder because they also had to write a good book. They also had to be in tune with this new 90s style book form Virgin, bigger than the show used to be style of writing. And they had to capture the tone and the vibe and the ethos of the era in which they're set. So a good book that feels like a 90s new adventure but is set in season 16 is not always the easiest thing to pull off, and some of them don't pull it off at all well. I think this does a pretty good job, not a perfect job, but a pretty good job of feeling like a season 16 story whilst being a story that is too broad and too deep for the television screen.
That last point is very important, which I'll be examining myself. Before we bring the spoiler curtain down, I'll just say again, if this has whet your appetite, but you're thinking, oh gosh, maybe I really don't remember this book, or you've never read it, etc., go and listen to our podcast episode from earlier in the week. Get up to date with it. It's almost a blow-by-blow synopsis of what goes on. Take about, 15 minutes of their time, Dave?
Yeah, about that.
Yeah, and then come back and listen to what's about to go on here. Let's bring that curtain down.
Or you can just dive headlong into it right now.
Ouch, it's a very heavy curtain.
I think the point you were going to make, Robin, I think I've got it down as my next point as well, let's see if I'm right, is to talk about the setting of the book.
Okay, great.
Because I think that one of the strengths of this book is that it does have that very big, well-realised setting. It has multiple locations, it has big extras if you were actually filming it, it has big explosions, lots of characters, and it does all that sort of thing, but it's not something that they could have made on a 1977-78 budget. You know, had they tried to do the docks of Shanghai, let's face it, it would have been the banks of the Thames. And Japan would have been a quarry. Let's not mince words. I found the setting really, really well done. Now, I don't know as much about 1930s Asia as I do about European history or American history or the like, but look, I've been to Taiwan, so I know a bit of the history of the Republic of China in the 1930s. My favourite movie ever is The Empire of the Sun, so I know a little bit about the Japanese and what was going on in Shanghai a decade later, because that movie's obviously set in part in Shanghai. I've seen The Last Emperor, so I know a bit more about Chinese politics in the 30s and what was going on with the puppet emperor of Manchuria and all that. So I had some touchstones and some reference points in which I could enjoy this book. But even if I hadn't, I thought McGinty does a pretty good job of putting us into a really well-researched, really detailed world that the book does justice to, that the TV show wouldn't have done justice to. Have I correctly stolen your point there, Rob?
Well, look, I've jotted down that the novel oozes attention to detail.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether that's because McGinty is a particular devotee of this period specifically, or he's just a history buff in general who likes to get his hands dirty with lots of research. This is more than just watching the intro to Temple of Doom 100 times and basing a novel there. I was being a little facetious earlier. You know, he's done some legwork to make this feel like a living, breathing sort of place. But I will comment that sometimes this desire to paint this bigger picture of the landscape and tell you what's happening here and what's what and, you know, all of this stuff, it seems to overtake what's happening with the Doctor. It feels like the Doctor's almost a bit player in this bigger picture for a lot of the novel, probably until about the last third, I'd say. And maybe that's actually realistic. He's just this guy who's shown up in a world that's doing its own thing and will be doing its own thing whether the Doctor's there or not. But I think when we're Doctor Who fans, we're reading this to see what our hero is doing, and almost at times it felt like the Doctor and Romana were pushed aside a bit or just being locked up while other stuff happened.
Yeah, I think that is correct. The research is really interesting. The research does add to the depth of the book. So overall, I praise it. But there are times where we get so into the weeds of some of these characters and so into the background of some of these characters that I did find myself struggling to keep up at times. And that doves into another point I had, which is very similar and related, in that there are a number of characters in this book who are all introduced very quickly in the first few chapters. And I did find myself having to pause a couple of times and go, okay, just let me get my head around this, right? There's Lee's the policeman, right? Okay, and there's young Chi, but he's actually Wu, and he's the vigilante who's actually a nightclub owner. And then later on, he's actually Japanese as well. And then there's Kwok, and Kwok works for Sen. And I was having to sort of pause and go, right, before I go into the next chapter, can I just double check in my mind who all these characters are?
Oh, and there was a guy called Jung, which I don't think even made it into our synopsis of the book, otherwise it'd get too convoluted. There was the German Vogler. It was like names. It was hard to keep a track of at times.
It was. And look, I don't know whether part of it is because we're very used to Western names in our literature, and so having very Chinese names meant we couldn't quite take it all in as much. I don't know if that's a thing. I hope it's not, but it could be. But yeah, there were a lot of characters who were all introduced very quickly, and it really wasn't until I was well into the novel I was comfortable with being able to identify who they all were and what they were all doing, at which point two of them have twists to their backstories where we find out that they're not what we think. In fact, in the case of Wu's character, he goes from being a vigilante to a nightclub owner to a Japanese agent and back to a nightclub owner. And it is like, okay, just calm down.
Yeah. I mean, Wu, who I think might be a hat tip to the filmmaker John Woo, who has made a lot of Hong Kong action films. I kept thinking that the whole way through the book.
It's funny you say that because my reference was Harry Hu from the Get Smart series.
Oh, is that right? Okay. Okay. Look, I don't know. And yes, he has this alter ego, Yan Che, which is akin to characters you'd see at the time in film serials. There are even references to that he's like these characters that are happening in the American film serials. And in a modern sense, he's kind of like Batman. You know, he's this vigilante who he explicitly says he's made it his mission to protect the ordinary people of the city he lives in. He gets around covertly in the shadows like Batman and does all that stuff. That's me putting a Western spin on this.
Yeah.
I found that quite fascinating, actually.
Oh, I liked it all, and it was genuinely interesting. And as I said, I got to sort of draw on my knowledge and my experience of Republic of China politics and history. And so that was really fascinating. But it did require an extra layer of effort in reading a book that I was enjoying, but there were times when, as I say, it felt a little bit harder than it perhaps could have been if he'd introduced these characters over a slightly longer period.
Yeah, you got to work at this one. Now, Wu's opposite, of course, quite literally is Li. Li is Chinese, but he's working with the Japanese, whereas Wu is Japanese, but protecting his people, who are Chinese, from what's going on.
But he's also working for the police who are working for the Tongs.
Indeed. So all of that is very interesting, and Li is quite cool in his own right, coming across as this very straight-laced police detective doing everything by the book. And he actually spends a lot of time with the Doctor. You know, once he stops trying to lock the Doctor up, they sort of do a lot of the adventure together. But in the end, he and Wu have to sort of face off, and he gets blown away. So this character who we've sort of been sympathetic to and has been likeable gets shot at the end of the book.
He's probably got the most interesting character arc of any of the characters in the book. Certainly, in my opinion, he has, because he does do that classic Doctor Who character thing of he starts as a very straight-laced, there's a rational explanation for everything police detective, and then he meets the Doctor and he has to start learning that maybe the world's a bit more complicated and a bit less perfect than he expected it was, and he's got to learn all about that. And as you say, you start to sort of like him, and he's almost like the Lightfoot in some ways of this book to the Doctor. Then you start to learn a bit more about who he is at his work with the Japanese and how ruthless he is. And you do start to go, actually, he's not that nice a person. After all, he's actually quite selfish. He's quite wicked. And then he gets his comeuppance. And look, I did feel that by the time Li and Wu had their final confrontation, I was on Wu's side.
Yes.
So it worked. But yes, it is a very good character arc, but it is a character arc that's kind of like the fifth layer of plot in this. So you know, it's like, you know, you're down to your fifth layer and you're still working quite hard on keeping track of this character's arc and motivation. So that makes for a good book. And I suspect if I read this again in 5 years' time, I would appreciate that, you know, there were all these extra layers that kept me interested, but it does make it a little bit harder at the time. Rob, can I pull out to some main characters, perhaps?
Yes.
I'm going to give you 3 quick takes, and you pick up on or disagree with what you think. I said at the start the job of the Missing Adventure is to capture the era as best it can. I thought that the Doctor was perfectly captured for season 16 here. McGinty really gives us that Doctor who, one moment he's being very silly and he's making jokes and he's sort of throwing ideas out there, and then he's telling us that this is a very, very serious thing indeed. And I thought he captured that part of the Tom Baker Doctor really well. Romana, I thought, was fine, but she didn't feel really characterised beyond being haughty. She's just haughty a lot, and she's detached a lot, which maybe reflects on Mary Tam's portrayal, I don't know.
Oh, cruel.
So disagree with me if you want. And look, K9 I thought was used well. He wasn't used as a get me out of jail too often. A couple of times he was. I liked that K9 was able to do things that he would have done in the show had they had the money to do it. For example, K9 going upstairs. It's not a magic thing. He's not suddenly able to float or anything like that. He's got a mechanism that sort of lifts his front paws up over one step and then drags his way up. And it's slow and it's cumbersome. And look, I'm sure if they could have afforded to do that in 1978, they would have. So it didn't feel like a cheat. It felt like expanding the character. So Doctor really good. Romana, K9, not bad. How do you feel about those 3?
Yeah, the Doctor was spot on. So many of the quips you could actually hear Tom say.
Yes.
Without doubt. Romana, when I was saying cruel about Mary Tam's performance, that was because I like Mary Tam very much.
Look, I know she has got fans, and I like her performance as well, but I do think when you try to write her in a book, there's not a lot of character to grapple onto.
There's not, but I did enjoy where Wu's going to get her to sing at the nightclub, and I'm thinking this would be so much out of her comfort zone. This would actually be really fun to watch if this was on TV.
Yeah, true.
You know, so I quite enjoyed that. And K9, you say he's not like a Deus Ex Machina, you know.
Too much.
Literally, because he is a machine. But, yeah, he does show up at some good moments, but in plausible ways, like you say, climbing those stairs. And I did enjoy when Mr. Sin's head comes rolling down the stairs, and K9 can hear it from a distance, like, as he's coming down the stairs. And then he lands near K9, and K9 just obliterates him because, he's out to get his master, so he's going to zap him.
Yeah, look, there were a couple of times where I thought the Doctor and Romana are in danger. What's going to happen? Oh, a red beam came and stunned those. I just thought that happened once or twice, a bit too often. But look, that did happen a lot in the TV series as well. So,
What got me the most is I think at least 2 or 3 times in the book, the Doctor's like, oh, I'll call K9, or Romana sends K9 to the Doctor. And K9 apparently is just trundling through 1930s Shanghai.
Yeah.
And no one cares.
Yeah, that crossed my mind as well. And look, I did also like that bit at the end, and I thought that the writer went into such trouble to make it very clear that K9 was going up some stairs, and it was going to take a while, and that K9 was on these stairs. And did we mention K9's on these stairs, by the way? And I thought there's got to be a payoff. I didn't expect the payoff was going to be that Mr. Sin's head bounces down the stairs and stops and gets obliterated. Yes, that was very well done.
Well, let's talk briefly about Mr. Sin before we get to a character like Senko, perhaps.
The Peking homunculus.
Yes, he comes across as so psychotic here. I really liked the way the writing would describe how the automaton actually works, how he sees the world, literally, because he can use different ways to sense what's going on. He's got different sort of visions that he can use. He can see people's heat signatures and things like that. But then there's also that pig side of his mind that when he gets zapped with the electricity, he goes a bit crazy. And when he does go crazy, wow, I mean, how many people does he kill in this book? Like it's 2 or 3 dozen, I think.
Yes, and you properly feel he's just reveling in the blood and the guts.
Mm-hmm.
It's really well done.
Yeah, he comes across as just, he's like the Terminator. He's like unstoppable. Especially with the dragon paths, where he can just drop into a dragon path and zip around, like how he zips into their plane. They're in midair, and suddenly Mr. Sin's in the plane in this little enclosed space. Like, oh my god, how scary would that be?
Yes, and then when they throw him out of the plane, he just goes through another dragon path and escapes.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, I really like the use of Mr. Sin once he came into the book. I will call out, though, the book is called The Shadow of Weng-Chiang.
Mm-hmm.
The book has Mr. Sin on the cover. And there is an artifact stolen from the Palace Theatre in the very first chapter of the book. It's pretty obvious that Mr. Sin is going to be in this book, and it's pretty obvious that the childlike person who is walking around with Senko is going to be Mr. Sin.
Right.
So I did feel that after the first couple of chapters, I was like, come on, David. We all know Mr. Sin's in the book. We all know what he looks like. Let's just stop, dangling this around.
Yeah, it's almost like he's writing the story like it's on TV in his head, and they're hiding the fact. And on TV that might be effective, but as you say, when it's a book with that name and he's on the damn cover, it just doesn't work.
Yeah,
it'd be like having the novel of Earthshock with Cybermen on the front or something, and still trying to really secretly, keep them out of the book or something.
Yeah, look, a minor point, because he was very well used. Can I talk about my biggest problem with the book, please, Rob?
Go for it.
I'm not quite sure what the point of the book was. Now, don't get me wrong. I was very curious to find out what was going on. I was very excited by the ending. There was a big build-up, and it ended with a big explosion, and the right people got killed, and the right people survived, and all of that. So, look, as an adventure, it works. But every so often, I'll just stop and go, what does Senko actually want? And why is she actually doing this? And what is the Tong going to get out of this? And it's kind of sort of answer that she wants her revenge on Greel, and she sort of wants to increase the powers of the dragon paths, but I just felt it was all a bit sort of nothing-ish. And particularly given that, and look, big spoiler is coming now, given that Magnus Greel doesn't turn up at the end of the book, which I thought might have been sort of the big denouement. The last few chapters are, and Magnus Greel is back, and now we discover what the real plan was, or now they've got to team up together to stop it. That didn't happen, and I think that's the right choice. But I did feel the stakes and the motivations for the plot never really felt quite right, or like they worked, or like they were put together.
Okay. I mean, to piece it together, she wants to get Greel to torture him for all eternity because of what he did to her father. To do that, she needs the nuclear reactor to zap the Dragon Paths, to knock him off course, have him land so that she can get him. To make the reactor, she needs the Tong to steal all the parts and move them into the mountain. So that's why she's promised the Tong, if you do this, your god will come back. That's kind of why I think she's got the Tong on one side building this reactor for her, or stealing the parts at least for it. And then what she wants to do once he arrives. So I took that okay. I thought Senko, I mean, she's the closest thing we have in the book to a villain, but interestingly, she's not villainous, or at least super villainous. You know, at least in the sense that we think of villains. I mean, she wants to get Magnus Greel and torture him, as we're saying, yes. But that's based on what he did to her father. So this is a family revenge, not just, oh, I'm evil me. And of course, she has no interest in killing the Doctor. And when she has Romana in her mountain lair, she lets her roam at will because she's so sure of the purity of her mission. So I think she's very interesting in that regard. And is that why you're wondering what the point is? Because she's not this typical villain with a typical straightforward desire? Is that it, maybe?
Yeah, I think that might be, because I did like her character. I thought she was interesting. I thought she was a bit different. She did feel like a villain that could be in season 16, which had a couple of really cool female villains, and it had a couple of very different types of villains. I'm thinking of somebody like Count Grendel of Grach, who's, you know, not a particularly evil person. He's just a selfish person, so to speak. So it works, but I don't think I ever quite felt that there was a big plot reason why she was the baddie. We had to stop her. It worked. Don't get me wrong. It wasn't bad. I just felt like the plot didn't really have the gravity that it could have. It had the adventure it needed to. So fine, great. But did I feel it was all a little bit lightweight? Maybe. Yes, I think I did.
Okay. Well, what about the plot insofar as being a sequel to Talons, Dave? I mean, I think it's clever insofar as what the audience would assume is that we'd go back to London and maybe start in that old theatre, and maybe Mr. Sin gets reanimated. So some of the aspects would actually be the same. But in this novel, we zoom away from London straight away, and we're in China with all this stuff going on. I thought it was clever. What do you think about that in terms of being a sequel?
Yeah, I think it was really, really good. I think that it sort of reminded me a bit of Kinder and Snake Dance, where they're sequels to each other, but they're very, very differently done. I think it's that sort of a sequel, and it worked really well. The setting was good. It had enough little references to keep fans going on. So there's one bit where Senko is reading somebody's diaries, and at that stage we don't know whose diaries they are, and she talks about how he met somebody called the Doctor with hair that curls like the ram, and you go, oh, I know where that line came from.
Yeah.
So yeah, and look, I think that I knew that Senko was going to be Lee Chang's daughter before it was revealed, based on the stuff she knew, but the fact that her name is Seng, as in Lee Seng, like I thought that was pretty clear pretty quickly.
Okay. The Dragon Paths, I think, are a neat invention to have us being able to zip all over the place without the drudgery of travel. Although, ironically, some of the key moments in the novel actually involve travel, such as when the Doctor's travelling to the mountain for the finale and he's in that plane. That's when Mr. Sin materialises on board. Or a bit later where he commandeers a train to get the rest of the way to the mountain. So there's actually this nice balance of instant travel, getting us from place to place and we're not wasting time, and travel that takes some time, but there's actually some interesting stuff happening while we travel, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it was a really cool idea. It was both useful for the plot, but it was also useful in getting me as a reader to go, what's going on here? How does this work? And again, it felt like a Tom Baker type technobabble excuse where he's talking about the telluric currents and stuff like that. I just thought, yeah, this feels like a Tom Baker explanation for why this stuff's going on.
Yeah. And how does this body from the museum in London where the guy was alive an hour ago, how does that end up in China? At the start, I was completely at sea.
Yeah, no, but I was as well. And also completely hooked with this idea of, I wonder what the explanation is there. There's going to be a cool sci-fi explanation, and I want to know what it is.
Yep, and I was surprised that Lucas Satan didn't have more of a role in the book. I already knew Lucas Satan because I've read the short story he's in one of the Decalogues, where he has an adventure with Pat Troughton.
Oh, okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So I was like, oh, Lucas Satan, it's the fallen angel. Oh my God, yeah, great. But he does this like sort of cameo at the start. Then he's like, oh, I'm going to send a telegram, and that's literally all we see of him. I don't think we even see Wu read the telegram. Like, I think Wu knows the information which we infer came from the telegram, but there's sort of no more Lucas Satan in the whole thing. So I don't know whether that's because maybe the character was created by, I want to say it was Andy Lane who wrote that short story, but I'm not 100% sure. Maybe McKinty was just borrowing the character, so didn't want to do much with it. I was actually a bit disappointed that Lucas Satan wasn't more of a thing in the book.
Yeah, I wasn't particularly disappointed about the character going because I didn't know that background of the character. But
okay.
I was surprised that having set up this London scene, and it didn't feel like one of those ones where they go, here's the prologue that happens over here, end of prologue, we're now moving somewhere else. It felt like a link to the story where they're going, I'm going to talk to my counterparts over there. And usually that would mean that at some point somebody arrives from England or they report back to England or there's a bit more of a linkage, whereas it really was just, I'm going to let them know that they stole Mr. Sin from London, over to you.
Yeah, that's it. When we're putting together the synopsis, one thing I noticed working on this file and just looking through it line by line, and I've mentioned it a few times now, Dave, is just how often people get captured in the novel. I just want to mention that one more time. I know being captured and being in a cell is a Doctor Who thing, but it happens in this novel. It feels like way more than it normally does in a Doctor Who story, which is quite a lot.
Yes, and there's also a lot of the, well, we've been captured and taken back to the baddies' headquarters, and now we've escaped, we can snoop around and get the important clue as to what's going on. I think they use that plot maybe just a little bit too much. As you say, it's a Doctor Who story. I accept it's going to be there a bit, but it did happen a lot.
Now, Dave, I think the story really ramps up towards the end. I wouldn't have necessarily called it slow early on, but in hindsight, not an awful lot happens. And then towards the end, it's like, this is the plan, here's a nuclear reactor, Mr. Sin's on a rampage, etc., etc. It becomes much more enjoyable in the final third, let's say, when you look back on it, or at least when I look back on it. When you read it slowly, I guess, when you're reading it a chapter or two at a time, you might not notice this, but when you sort of do a synopsis of it, you realise, oh gosh, this really does sort of speed up towards the end.
I think that's absolutely correct. I think that the depth of the worlds and the settings and the characters do keep you going through that first part of the novel. I think wanting to find out what the explanations are keeps you going as well. So it's not as though I struggled through the first part of the novel, but McGinty is very good at building up the tension and building up the excitement as it gets towards the end. And by the end I was sort of like, oh, I can keep going a bit longer, can't I? Yeah, well, what does happen to the nuclear reactor? Okay, yeah. So yeah, I totally agree with you.
Anything else before we wrap up?
Well, just one point from me. We have talked about the historical research that McGinty did, and it is very, very good. And I was also really interested by some of the other stuff he had in that bump section that you mentioned at the very start, where he does actually go on and say, I know that some of these things are not quite historically accurate, but I need to make it work for the book. So one example he says is, look, I know that by the 1930s, the Tongs had kind of died out, and I know that they were about to become what we know as the Triads, but neither of those kind of would be right for the 1930s. You're a Doctor Who fan, so you know what the Tong or the Black Scorpion is, so I'm going to call them Tongs. I know it's not correct. Please don't go to, alt.com. Doctor Who or whatever it was and tell me I'm wrong. Reckhart's Doctor Who, and tell me I'm wrong. He does also have a glossary at the end, which I must admit I didn't need, but I can understand why he felt it was necessary. But that's just a reflection, I think, of the research that he has done and that he's quite well known for.
Yeah, I thought that was really great. And look, I would have read the whole bump section, to be honest, but I wanted to rip into doing the review.
Fair enough.
Look, to summarise, I'll take lead here, Dave, and then you can let me know. I'm going to say something that might seem controversial. I'm still not entirely sure, even after this conversation with you now. I'm not sure this fully works as a Doctor Who novel. I know the remit for the NAs, and I suppose the MAs, was stories too big for the small screen. So I guess it's making good on that promise, and good on David A. McInty for that. But when you're reading this thing that's sort of part Indiana Jones and part James Bond, I mean, the whole racing around to stop a nuclear reactor in a big mountain base feels super Bond. There were times I couldn't quite visualise this as a Tom Baker adventure in the middle of Season 16. Of course, there are parts where I could. The idea of the Dragon Paths is very Doctor Who. Mr. Sin is established in Doctor Who. I think McInty gets the Doctor and Romana right, as we were talking earlier, particularly with regard to the Doctor. So there are parts where I'm like, okay, this is great. But there were other parts where I'm like, this maybe doesn't feel like Doctor Who. So I'm a bit torn on it.
Would you recommend it?
Well, look, it's my next little note that I've scratched down is that it's very hard to score. I think it's a very solid novel. I was entertained by it, and you can feel the effort put into getting stuff right, aside from that bit you just read from Bump. But does it have entirely the right vibe? Maybe not. I would give it a 7.5 out of 10, and I would direct it more to people who like gun Doctor Who and history-related Doctor Who. And I know that's not everyone. There are people out there who just want a big, fuzzy, happy run around, and they're not going to like this at all.
That's very correct. If you just want a big, fun run around with Jago and Lightfoot, this is not the book for you.
No.
I'll say that right at the start. Look, I think that of the David A. McGinty books that I've read, and I've read quite a few of his, I would have it pretty solidly in the middle. It's not one of his greats. It's certainly better than a couple of his weaker ones. So I think it's good there. I probably have the advantage over you, Rob, in that I've read a lot more of the Missing Adventures than you have, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm going to say that as an example of the range, it is up in the top third, maybe the top quarter, because a lot of other books struggle a lot more to reconcile that point I was making earlier about how do you feel like a season 16 story whilst also being a big and complicated novel as we've come to expect in 1996. I think this balances that better than most, and so it's one of the better success stories of the range. Is it in my top 5 Missing Adventures? No, it's not. Would it break into my top 10? Yeah, I think it probably would. I think that although it's got its faults, certainly some of the plotting is, in my view, a little insubstantial. As a history buff, I really enjoyed it. As somebody who likes characters, I really enjoyed it. It ramped up the adventure just when it needed to. Is it perfect? No. Was it a solid read that never felt like a chore? Yeah, very, very much so. I think if you're curious about the Missing Adventures, this would not be a bad place to start.
Excellent. I think we're both roughly in the same area.
Yeah, look, I think we are. I might go an 8 rather than a 7, but we're in the same space.
Yeah, well, 7.5 for me, so I think we're very close.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah, we're coming at it from maybe different angles, because you have read more of the MAs, you're coming at it from that sort of angle, I'm coming at it fresh. This is a book I know nothing about, I've never read it before, and yet we've ended up within half a point of each other, so I think this is a pretty good review for people, Dave.
I hope so. As always, let us know.
Brilliant.